He never fired a shot, never commanded an army. But in 1720, John Law held more power than any general in Europe because he controlled something far more dangerous than gunpowder. He controlled belief. This is the story of how one man convinced an entire kingdom to bet everything on paper, and how, when the music stopped, France nearly tore itself apart. Let's go back to May 1716. France is drowning, not in floodwater, in debt. Louis XIV, the Sun King, spent 26 years at war. He built Versailles. He funded armies that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. And when he died in 1715, he left behind a kingdom that owed more than it could ever produce. 2 billion livres, roughly equal to the entire national income. The interest alone was greater than tax revenue. France was, in every meaningful sense, bankrupt. Enter John Law, a Scottish gambler, a convicted murderer who escaped execution in London after killing a man in a duel, a financial theorist who had been laughed out of Scotland, rejected by England, turned away by Italy. But France was desperate, and desperate men listened to dangerous ideas. So who exactly was John Law? Born in Edinburgh in April of 1671, he came from a family of goldsmiths and bankers. His father owned Lauriston Castle, a landed estate on the Firth of Forth. At 14, Law joined the family business, learning the mechanics of banking and credit. But when his father died in 1688, something shifted. Law abandoned the firm. He traveled to London and fell into the life of a rake, gambling, dueling, chasing aristocratic women through the salons of Bloomsbury. On April 9, 1694, he fought a duel with Edward Bow Wilson over the affections of Elizabeth Villiers. Law killed Wilson with a single thrust of his sword. He was arrested, tried at the Old Bailey, and sentenced to death by the notorious hanging judge, Salathiel Lovell. But Law had friends in high places. His sentence was commuted to a fine. Wilson's brother appealed. Law was imprisoned again, and this time he escaped. He fled to Amsterdam, and that's where the real story begins. For the next decade, Law moved between Amsterdam, Venice, and Paris. He studied the mechanics of banking in Holland, a country that had pioneered credit systems and joint stock companies. He watched how the Dutch East India Company raised capital, how the Bank of Amsterdam facilitated trade by allowing merchants to deposit silver and transact in paper receipts. He also gambled. Professionally, Law had an extraordinary gift for mathematics. He could calculate odds faster than most men could count cards, and he used that skill to fund himself across Europe, amassing what contemporaries described as a considerable fortune. But gambling wasn't just a vice for Law. It was a laboratory, because gambling taught him something fundamental, that value is subjective, that a piece of paper, a playing card, a promissory note, could be worth whatever people believed it was worth, and if you could manipulate that belief, you could create wealth from nothing. By 1700, Law had returned to Scotland with a proposal. He wanted to establish a national bank that would issue paper currency backed not by silver, but by land. His argument was elegant. Silver, he said, was an arbitrary measure of value. Its price fluctuated wildly depending on how much Spanish galleons brought back from the New World land. On the other hand, was constant. It produced grain, livestock, timber, real wealth. So why not issue money based on the value of land itself? The Scottish Parliament debated his proposal extensively in the summer of 1705. Law even published his treatise, Money and Trade Considered, laying out the full architecture of his system. But Scotland rejected him. By a narrow margin, so Law tried England. Rejected again. He tried the Duke of Savoy in Italy, who told him the idea was brilliant, but that he needed a bigger stage. By 1715, Law was in Paris, and France, teetering on the edge of financial collapse, was finally ready to listen. So what was Law's idea? Here's the simple version. He believed that money didn't need to be gold or silver, it could be paper, as long as people believed in it. And if you could create that belief, you could create wealth itself. Law had written about this back in 1705 in his treatise Money and Trade Considered. He argued that the value of money came not from the metal it was made of, but from what it could buy. Land, he said, was the true foundation of wealth. It produced grain, timber, livestock, It was real, tangible. So why not issue money backed by land instead of silver? The idea wasn't entirely new. Banks had been operating in Italy and Holland for decades. But Law wanted to go further. He wanted to merge the power of a national bank with the monopoly of a trading company and use that fusion to absorb the entire national debt. In other words, turn France's crushing burden into an asset that could be bought and sold. The regent of France, Philippe II, the Duke of Orléans, saw the elegance in it, or maybe he just saw no other option. On May 2, 1716, Law was granted permission to establish the Banque Générale, a private bank that could issue paper notes redeemable in silver. The notes were denominated in écus d'espèce, silver coins of a fixed weight. This was critical. It meant Law's notes wouldn't lose value if the government debased the currency, which French kings did constantly. Within a year, the bank was a success. Merchants preferred Law's notes to actual coins. They were lighter, easier to carry, harder to counterfeit. By December 1718, the Banque Générale became the Banque Royale. The king now owned it outright. Law had just been handed the printing press of a nation. But the bank was only the first piece. In August 1717, Law founded the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West. Its charter gave it exclusive trading rights in Louisiana, France's sprawling, largely unexplored territory in North America. The idea was simple. Investors could exchange their holdings of worthless government debt for shares in the company. Instead of waiting decades for the crown to maybe pay them back, they could own a piece of France's future in the New World. The company's capital was set at 100 million livres, divided into 200,000 shares at 500 livres each. At first, the shares traded below par. Around 300 livres, nobody believed Louisiana was worth anything. It was a backwater, a swamp, a wilderness that had cost France far more than it had ever returned. But Law wasn't selling Louisiana. He was selling a dream. He commissioned artists to paint romanticized visions of the Mississippi Delta. Lush forests, fertile valleys, rivers teeming with fish. He spread stories of gold mines waiting to be discovered, of vast plantations that would rival the sugar islands of the Caribbean. None of it was true, but none of it mattered. Because by May 1719, Law had expanded the company. It absorbed the monopolies on trade with India, China, and Africa. It was renamed the Compagnie des Indes, the Company of the Indies. Now it controlled all of France's overseas commerce. Then in the summer of 1719, Law acquired the right to mint coins and the right to collect France's indirect taxes, the farm of revenues that had always been controlled by private financiers. By August, Law's company wasn't just a trading venture, it was the French state's fiscal arm. And here's where it gets extraordinary. On August 16, 1719, Law announced his plan to eliminate the national debt entirely. He would issue new shares in the Compagnie des Indes, enough to buy back all outstanding government bonds, annuities, and offices that had been sold to raise money. Holders of these debts could exchange them for company stock, which promised a 4% annual dividend. But here's the trick. Law didn't just offer shares at face value. He issued them at 5,000 livres each, 10 times the original price. Why would anyone pay that? Because Law had created a feedback loop. The more shares he issued, the more demand there was. The higher the price went, the more people believed it would keep going. Investors could buy shares on installment. 10% down, the rest spread over months. And if you couldn't afford even that, the Banque Royale would lend you money, using the shares themselves as collateral. It was leverage on belief. By the end of September 1719, Law had issued 3 massive rounds of new stock in 3 weeks. 300,000 additional shares at 5,000 livres each. That's 1.5 billion livres in new capital, raised in less than a month. The frenzy was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. A narrow street in Paris called the Rue Quincampoix became the center of the stock market. Merchants, aristocrats, servants, foreigners. They packed the alley from dawn to dusk, shouting bids, signing contracts on each other's backs. One contemporary reported that 30,000 foreign speculators flooded into Paris in the fall of 1719. This comes from Carswell's The South Sea Bubble, citing period accounts. Coachmen became millionaires overnight, servants bought carriages, A hunchback man rented out his back as a writing desk for contracts and made enough to retire. The word millionaire was coined during this period. It didn't exist before John Law. In the salons of Paris, people spoke of Law as if he were a magician. Some called him the new Midas. Others whispered that he had made a pact with the devil. The price of Compagnie des Indes shares hit 10,000 livres by November. That's a 20-fold increase in 6 months. John Law had become the richest, most powerful man in France. In January 1720, the regent appointed him Controller General of Finances, effectively the Prime Minister of Economic Policy. He converted to Catholicism in a quiet ceremony at a monastery in Melun. He was elected to the Royal Academy of Sciences. He bought estates across France, the Château de Tancarville, the Château de Guermantes, vast tracts of land in Normandy and Toucy. He purchased the western wing of the Palais Mazarin and commissioned Venetian painters to redecorate it. The building became the new headquarters of the Compagnie des Indes and later the Paris Stock Exchange itself. At the height of his power, Law controlled the money supply of France, the national tax system, all overseas trade, the national debt, the stock market. No one in European history, not even the great banking families like the Medici or the Fuggers, had ever concentrated so much financial power in one set of hands. He had done it. He had turned debt into prosperity, or so it seemed. But here's the thing about belief. It's fragile, and Law's system depended on one critical assumption, that the supply of paper money and the supply of shares would stay balanced with the demand for them, but they didn't. Between December 1718 and April 1720, the Banque Royale issued over 2.5 billion livres in paper notes. That's more than twice the amount of silver coinage that had existed in France before Law arrived. This data comes from Harsen's 1928 study, Doctrine monétaire et financière en France. At first, this didn't matter. People wanted the notes. They could use them to buy shares, pay taxes, settle debts. But by early 1720, something shifted. People started asking a simple question. What happens if everyone tries to convert their notes into silver at the same time? The answer was obvious. There wasn't enough silver. The first cracks appeared in late 1719. A few wealthy investors, mostly foreigners who had made fortunes on the initial rise, began quietly converting their shares back into hard currency and leaving France in November. The share price stalled. Law issued 30 million livres worth of new shares to stabilize it. It worked for a moment. But in December, the exodus began. Exchange rates tell the story. The pound sterling suddenly appreciated sharply against the livre in late November, a classic sign of capital flight. Neal and Schubert document this in their 1985 study, The First Rational Bubbles, using semi-weekly exchange rate data from London. The Dutch, who had been among the first foreign speculators to arrive, were also among the first to leave. They had seen this before, the tulip mania of 1637. They knew how it ended. Law tried to control the panic. In February 1720, he closed the stock exchange for a week, hoping to calm the market. It didn't work. The price of shares crashed from 9,000 livres to 7,000 in a matter of days. He reopened the market on February 23rd, this time with the Compagnie des Indes itself buying and selling shares at a fixed price of 9,000 livres. The price stabilized for a while, but the printing presses kept running, and the more notes that flooded the economy, the less each one was worth. By March of 1720, the streets of Paris were electric with tension. Bread prices had doubled. Craftsmen refused payment in paper, demanding silver. Rumors spread that the Banque Royale's vaults were empty, that Law had been printing money with nothing to back it. On March 11th, Law took a desperate step. He demonetized gold. He declared that only silver and paper currency would be accepted for transactions. It was a radical move. Gold had always been the bedrock of wealth in France. Nobles hoarded gold Louis coins. Merchants settled international debts in gold. But Law needed to protect the paper system. If gold became the refuge of last resort, the entire structure would collapse. The decree backfired. People rioted. They accused Law of trying to steal their wealth. On May 21, 1720, Law issued a decree that should have been unthinkable. He announced that the value of both shares and banknotes would be gradually reduced, by 50% over 6 months. In other words, law admitted that the money wasn't worth what it claimed to be. The reaction was instantaneous. Riots broke out in Paris. A mob surrounded Law's carriage outside the Palais Mazarin. He barely escaped with his life. The regent, terrified of civil war, forced him to reverse the decree 6 days later. But it was too late. The illusion was broken. Imagine what it felt like. You're a merchant in Paris. You've traded your government bonds, which you thought were worthless, for shares in the Compagnie des Indes. Those shares have made you rich beyond your wildest dreams. You've bought a house, you've hired servants, you've sent your son to study in the countryside, and then the man who created this wealth, the man everyone called a genius, announces that it's all worth half of what you thought. And then, 6 days later, he changes his mind again. What do you believe now? Nothing. On July 6, 1720, the Banque Royale suspended payments. It could no longer convert notes to silver. The doors of the bank were mobbed. People crushed against each other in the narrow streets, waving fistfuls of paper, screaming for their money back. Law was removed as Comptroller General of Finances on May 29th. He tried to salvage what he could, but he had lost the trust of the regent. He had lost the trust of the people. In September, the Banque Royale closed its exchange offices entirely. Banknotes were now just paper. They couldn't buy bread. They couldn't pay rent. They were worthless. By October, banknotes were trading at a 90% discount. A note that said 1,000 livres could barely buy a loaf of bread. The Compagnie des Indes itself survived. Barely. It was restructured, its monopolies curtailed. It would limp along for decades as a shadow of what law had envisioned. But the damage was done. Families that had mortgaged their estates to buy shares lost everything. Aristocrats who had spent their newfound fortunes on carriages and country homes were ruined. Servants who had become millionaires were servants again, if they were lucky. John Law, the man who had once controlled the wealth of a kingdom, fled France in disguise on December 14, 1720. He traveled under a false name, dressed as a woman in some accounts. He made his way to Brussels, then to Venice. He tried to rebuild. He gambled again, hoping to recapture his fortune, but the magic was gone. He died in Venice on March 21, 1729, at the age of 57. Broke, forgotten. Buried in the church of San Moise, where his gravestone can still be seen today. So what happened? Some historians say Law was a swindler, a con man who dressed up a Ponzi scheme in the language of economics. Others, like the economist Antoine Murphy, argue that Law's plan wasn't fundamentally flawed. The problem, Murphy says, wasn't the theory. It was the execution and the greed of insiders who issued far more stock than the company could ever justify. Murphy's John Law, economic theorist and policymaker, published in 1997, remains the most comprehensive modern analysis. Murphy calls Law's early phase le plan sage, the wise plan. If Law had stopped in mid-1719, if he had let the company grow organically, if he had resisted the pressure to absorb the entire national debt, it might have worked. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Because once the system started, it had its own momentum. Each new issue of stock created demand for the next. Each round of lending created the need for more banknotes. The machine had to keep running, or it would collapse. And Law, for all his brilliance, didn't have the tools to control it. He had no precedent to follow, no central bank doctrine, no regulations on leverage or reserve requirements, no lender of last resort to step in when panic took hold. He was improvising. And eventually the improvisation failed. But here's what we know for certain. Law's system did one thing brilliantly. It mobilized capital. For 2 years, France had access to credit it could never have borrowed otherwise. Industries expanded. Shipbuilding increased. Ports like Nantes and Bordeaux boomed. The number of French merchant ships grew from 16 to 300. This comes from Will and Ariel Durant's The Age of Voltaire, citing period records. Law instituted reforms that went far beyond finance. He broke up large landholdings to benefit peasants. He abolished internal road and canal tolls. He offered low-interest loans to start new industries. He even tried to create a progressive income tax that would include the nobility and the church, groups that had been exempt from taxation for centuries. Some of these reforms lasted. Others were swept away in the collapse. But for a brief moment, France had a glimpse of what a modern economy could look like. And then it was gone. But it also did something catastrophic. It taught an entire generation that paper money was a lie. For the next 150 years, the French collective memory of John Law meant that even the word bank was spoken with suspicion. Kindleberger notes this in A Financial History of Western Europe. When Napoleon needed to fund his wars, he avoided paper currency entirely, relying instead on plunder and taxation. When France finally established a true central bank, the Banque de France, it wasn't until 1800, and even then, it was structured to prevent any single individual from wielding law's kind of power. The trauma lingered, and it wasn't just France. The collapse of Law's system sent shockwaves across Europe. In England, the South Sea Company watched Law's methods closely. They copied his techniques, the installment payments, the loans on stock, the promises of endless growth. In the summer of 1720, as Law's system was collapsing in Paris, the South Sea bubble was inflating in London. English speculators poured money into South Sea stock, convinced they could avoid France's mistakes. They couldn't. The South Sea bubble burst in September 1720. Just months after Law's collapse, fortunes vanished. Banks failed. Sir Isaac Newton himself lost £20,000 and famously remarked, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." In Amsterdam, a rash of speculative ventures sprang up in June and July 1720, copying both the French and English models. They collapsed by October. The exchange rates between Paris, London, and Amsterdam gyrated wildly. Capital fled from one city to another and back again, chasing rumors and hope. It was the first international financial crisis, the first time that markets in different countries were linked so tightly that a collapse in one triggered collapses in others. And it all began with John Law. But so did the lesson. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Law wasn't entirely wrong. Modern economies run on exactly the belief he tried to create. Money today isn't backed by gold. It's backed by trust in governments, in institutions, in the stability of systems we can't see or touch: the US dollar, the euro, the yen. None of them are redeemable for silver or gold. They're valuable because we agree they're valuable. That's Law's insight, and it's the foundation of every modern economy. The difference is that we've learned slowly and painfully how to manage that trust. We have central banks that control the money supply. We have regulations that limit leverage. We have lenders of last resort, institutions that step in when panic takes hold. We have deposit insurance so bank runs don't destroy the system. We have transparency requirements so investors can see what they're buying. We have centuries of hard-won knowledge about how to prevent bubbles, or at least how to soften the crash when they burst. John Law had none of that. He had only belief, and when belief shattered, he had nothing. There's a medal that was struck in 1720 during the collapse. It shows a man dressed in fine clothes, holding shares in one hand and banknotes in the other. The inscription reads, "Cuvi modo Croesus erat, Irus et subito." He who was once as rich as Croesus is suddenly a beggar like Irus. It's sardonic, cruel even, but it's also a reminder that wealth built on paper can vanish as quickly as it appears, that belief, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild, and that the line between genius and madness, between innovation and catastrophe, is thinner than we'd like to admit. In the end, John Law's legacy is a paradox. He created the blueprint for modern finance and the template for modern financial disaster. He proved that paper money could work and that it could destroy nations. He showed us that capital, properly mobilized, could transform economies overnight, and that improperly managed, it could burn them to the ground just as fast. Today, when we talk about quantitative easing or stimulus packages or the money supply, we're talking about ideas that John Law pioneered. When we worry about inflation or currency crises or asset bubbles, we're worrying about the ghosts he left behind. He never wore a crown, never commanded an army, but he shaped the world we live in. Because John Law didn't just bankrupt a kingdom, he showed us what happens when trust becomes currency and how quickly that currency can burn.